Great, thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, just about, and welcome to you all to this webinar on insider fraud, which is being presented as part of Charity Fraud Awareness Week, of which we are now in day 4, although it seems like day 304 for some of us. So Charity Fraud Awareness Week brings together everybody that's involved in the charity and not-for-profit sectors to try and raise awareness and share good best practice in tackling fraud and financial crime. So we would really encourage you to share this webinar and any of our other resources with any colleagues and across your sort of professional network. If you're joining us live, we would really welcome any questions that you have throughout the webinar. Questions could be submitted at any time using the Q&A box, which you can see on screen. And we'll try and answer as many of these questions as we can towards the end of the session. And I am absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to host this session, because we have got some really excellent speakers for you. So I don't want to take up too much time listening to me when you've got some experienced colleagues that we can actually learn from. But obviously this is a webinar about insider fraud, which the statistics tell us that is a singular risk to the charity sector, indeed to many of the sectors. It is one of those things which is people don't want to admit to, they don't want to agree that it goes on, but it is something that we see happening again and again and again. So we are very delighted to welcome you all to this session. And as we're going to be talking about insider fraud, we're going to be talking about how your greatest asset, which is going to be your staff, can sometimes be one of your greatest problems, i.e. how do you deal with these issues where you have people who you don't know what their intentions are, and the long-term problems this can cause, not just sort of reputationally and to financial issues as per your traditional risks of fraud, but far deeper into sort of staff morale and ongoing issues. Okay, so I will stop there and I'm going to introduce the first of our 4 excellent speakers. So first up is Tracy Carpenter, who is an insider threat proposition manager from CIFAS. Tracy has a background in detecting and investigating internal fraud, as well as internal fraud strategically. She's got an experience in online banking and check fraud, but it's internal fraud that she's most interested in. She works to equip CIFAS members with the tools they need to combat insider threat and ensure that they are aware of where the risks lie within their organisation, especially with the transition to home working. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Tracy.
Thanks very much, Dave. So the Internal Fraud Database is the only database in the UK that records instances of dishonest conduct by job applicants and employees in the workforce. And that database helps employers to identify potential threats to their organisation. There's a lot of different types of conduct that's filed to the Internal Fraud Database. And just at a glance, the type of activity that includes is your straightforward theft from employer. So for example, cash, theft from customers, maybe customers' homes or third parties, customer property or stock. So for example, laptops, mobile phones, merchandise, even stationery. Divulging customer and company data, which I'll be covering later on. Bribery and corruption, manipulating timesheets, falsifying expenses, manipulation of systems, so for example, to show that somebody's hit a target when they haven't, unauthorised payments or refunds for friends or family members, and false employment applications. There's a lot of other scenarios of internal fraud that are recorded to the database, but just at a glance, that will give you an idea of the type of conduct that is recorded. Our members can search against hundreds of thousands of records of confirmed fraud risk cases covering employee and consumers to ensure that employees have that highest level of integrity, which is what we want to see with our employees. We all know that the landscape has rapidly changed and employees are now given that greater flexibility as to how they work and where they work from compared to this time 2 years ago. And in turn, that also means generally less supervision. The top filing reason that we saw during the pandemic was dishonest action by staff, and that was predominantly for thefts of cash. And you might be thinking, oh, it's okay because we don't deal in cash, so we don't really need to worry about that. But the next common type was false employment applications. And that includes candidates not declaring adverse credit data, dismissals from previous employers, and criminal convictions. And it's really concerning to think that employees can enter a charity or any organisation having not been honest about their employment history. And it can really be increasingly difficult for employers to identify, for example, if a candidate actually knows somebody who operates a small family-run business, who's willing to provide that false reference for them. And that is something that we have seen in the past, but by searching against the CIFAS database, you can find out the conduct of an individual or an employee that you maybe wouldn't be aware of just from searching a reference. I think it's fair to say we all feel better when we've helped a charity, and whether that's time that we donate, money, goods to be sold in charity shops, we want to support a particular charity because we really believe in the cause and what they stand for. And that reputational damage, if somebody is committing fraud against your charity, can really lead to adverse media stories, which can be very damaging from the result that maybe people will turn their back on a charity who they have supported previously due to the actions on occasion of one individual, especially if it's identified that actually those correct processes and controls weren't in place to protect the funds of that charity in the first place. The majority of cases which are filed to the internal fraud database are identified due to internal controls, and that demonstrates a need for charities to have that robust internal fraud control framework in place. However, we have recently seen that the number of frauds identified by customers and other staff has increased significantly. So it's imperative that you have a process in place for what to do if a colleague or a customer reports their suspicions to you. And I know that we've got Liz from Protect joining us later, so I'm not going to cover the whistleblowing policies around that. Generally, when fraud is committed, it falls into one of three areas: opportunity, motivation, and rationalisation. And that regular screening of employees can identify if they're under financial pressure. For example, have they manipulated lending applications, or have they allowed funds to be laundered through their bank account? If so, what would their next step be? Would it for them to be committing fraud against your charity? We're constantly hearing at the moment in the press that the price of goods are going up, the price of utility bills. How are those employees who are already in financial difficulty being supported? Because we do know from past experience that employees that would never normally commit fraud can then be provided with the motivation to do so if it means they will keep a roof over their families' heads and food on the table. And they're also more likely to rationalise that because they won't see it as they are blowing that money on frivolous purchases. They're actually doing it to care for their family. Employees may also be able to rationalise committing fraud if they're disgruntled, and that will really motivate them in a post-COVID environment where, for example, you've got some colleagues who are working from home, there's no intention for them to return to the office, People doing exactly the same role, but for some reason they're having to work from the office, they're having to factor in travel time, travel expenses, and other colleagues can work from home. And that can lead employees to be disgruntled, and they feel that actually I'm owed that money because I'm working long hours, I'm paying for my travel expenses. And employees will undoubtedly have that opportunity to commit fraud if there isn't those correct controls in place. And I really can't emphasise enough how organisations should have a robust strategy in place for how to identify internal fraud and protect themselves against the insider threat. You can't wait for somebody else to have identified that fraud. You have to be proactive in your approach. And we do have a range of courses available at CIFAS that cover the insider threat, bribery and corruption, investigations, and so on. Last year, we saw a 43% increase in filings made to the database for unlawful obtaining or disclosure of personal data. And that's actually really concerning, as it coincides with many organisations moving to that home working approach, or those who are working in an office environment, there not being those dual controls in place. You're kind of more isolated due to social distancing requirements. Many employees, especially those in more junior roles, wouldn't in an office environment be in a position where they can sit there with their mobile phone on their desk, and they certainly wouldn't be able to be sat there taking photos of their screen. But when employees are working from home, we don't know what they're doing. We have to have that degree of trust that they are working ethically, because without the trust, then again can lead to disgruntled employees. So we have to have that degree of trust, but combining that with internal fraud controls. These cases for unlawful obtaining or disclosure of personal data are mostly related to disclosure of customer data to a third party. And some of that was also fraudulent personal use of customer data. And generally those who were filed for that reason were between 31 and 40, whereas those filed for submitting false employment applications were mainly between 21 and 30. In 2020, 65% of filings to the internal fraud database were male and aged between 21 and 30. And 40% of those recorded had actually only been in employment for between 1 and 2 years. The intelligence team at CIFAS have identified intelligence recently that suggests that employees are advertising their knowledge of internal processes and systems on the dark web and online forums. And in exchange for payments, they will provide that confidential information to third parties, which will allow them to then go on and commit fraud. We're also seeing reports of employees being approached via LinkedIn to commit fraud in exchange for payments. And this has been happening across other social media platforms for several years, but we've now seen that move to LinkedIn. All organisations have that responsibility to ensure that there's a zero tolerance policy in place relating to internal fraud, and ensure that employees actually understand there are consequences in place to such conduct. And it's not just a case of you can resign, you can walk away, and there's no further action if you're identified committing fraud. Back over to you, Dave. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Tracy. That was really, really interesting. A really good insight into some of the motivating factors of why insider fraud is such a threat, and also some of that data, was extremely telling and really does expose the sort of shocking scale of it. So that was really interesting. Thank you very much, Tracy.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to move to Aisha from Save the Children International. So Aisha is the Global Fraud Director for Save the Children International, and she is a counter-fraud examiner with over 10 years experience of investigations, risk management and compliance. So she leads a global team of 10 staff covering the 5 different regions within Save the Children, and she leads on the implementation of the fraud strategy and is also responsible for the incident management for Save the Children International. So Aisha, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Hello, everyone. I would like to build further on what Tracy has talked about, and just to link into what are some of the practical challenges that charities face in detecting and responding to insider fraud and fraud complaints. And one of the, if I could summarize it into three major areas, one being resource. So most of the charity organizations that are around are facing great challenge with resource and ability to make provisions for this resource. And this resourcing are both in terms of investigation resource within the organization, as well as the counter fraud resource, that the organization requires. And this could be as a result of course, budget availability with different organizations, and the ability to really be able to get donors fund for these positions within different organizations. Being a counter fraud person, or somebody who's worked in this field, it's critical that organizations make budget availability and build on this resource, because this is an opportunity for these organizations to really respond to reports that come through in a timely manner. And over the years, it's clear that when you look at the response capacity of an organization, then it will really define in terms of what's that sense of direction that the organization is taking in regards to its fraud strategy or counter fraud strategy in regards to responding. The other biggest, I would call, challenge that agencies face or charity organizations face is in terms of lack of clear policy. If an organization does not have a clear policy in terms of managing or countering fraud, and a zero tolerance policy towards fraud, bribery, and corruption, then this definitely would be a challenge for a charity to respond to fraud complaints. And it's not only about having a policy in place, but the ultimate question is staff aware of this policy? Do they know, how to detect fraud incidents when they see one? Are they comfortable in reporting them? And what are some of the reporting channels that are available for these complaints to come through? So policy and procedure on fraud, and most importantly, zero tolerance policy towards fraud is a critical aspect to ensuring that charities are able to make progress in fraud detection and responding to fraud incidents. The other aspect is for charities that's very critical is lack of a clear strategy on how they will counter fraud and manage the risk of fraud. Over the last years, the risk of fraud is imminent in what we do, and like Dave earlier said, it's our employees that are perpetrating most of this fraud, and we need to have, as organizations, we need to have clear strategies in place in terms of how to respond to this. And this strategy would cut across from awareness to reporting, like I earlier mentioned. And when we talk of awareness, is like I said, do agencies, do the employees of these agencies or organizations, are they aware of what fraud is? What is the definition of fraud? And are they able to even detect that fraud occurs? And when they do this, then, you know, how often is this policy sensitized by the organization to its employees? You know, how frequent are employees made aware, and not only employees, but you know, even the partners, for example, that are working with this charities organization, even you know, beneficiaries and contractors and suppliers. So it's everyone involved to be aware of what fraud is, and for them to be aware of how to detect this type or the different types of fraud that occur, and most importantly then how to report this incident. You know, as an organization, there is need to always build a proper reporting mechanism whereby reports are managed and looked at independently. Now, reflecting back to the first point that I mentioned on resource, so if you have a dedicated, you know, counter fraud resource, then you can be able to have some source or some level of assurance in terms of how these reports come through and they're looked at, and then, you know, responded with the right level of emphasis or effort that's required. Remember that, you know, when you have fraud perpetrated by your own employees, then there is always the second bit to it, which is if you do not have proper reporting channels that you know, are independent, that ensure confidentiality, then employees would be afraid to report because they would fear, you know, reprimand or even consequences that would come with them reporting. And sometimes they would be faced to having to report senior employees or, you know, senior staff within the organization that are perpetrating this types of fraud. So reporting channels that are independent, that are you know, ensure confidentiality of the reporters is a critical solution to managing the challenge of reporting. And then building onto that is on responding. Now, when these reports come, what happens for charities? I think it's critical that we ensure that we respond adequately and on a timely manner on any reports that come through of fraud, because it's the only way that organizations can build the confidence of to its employees in terms of what the systems are working like, and also build on capacity to investigate. So it's one critical aspect that would look at addressing the challenge of a timely response to fraud incidents, such that as reports are coming through, then as an organization, you're able to respond to these reports in a timely manner, and also take actions against perpetrators in a timely manner as well, to ensure that the organization minimizes on the loss and manages ultimately the risk of fraud. And finally, it's on prevention. Now, in terms of one of the challenges, like I mentioned earlier, is lack of a holistic, clear strategy. For the strategy, for counter fraud strategy, prevention is a key aspect of managing the risk of fraud, and this, of course, is built on looking at what are some of the data aspects that the organization has, and it can be built on looking at trends. What are some of the types of fraud that you're seeing coming from your organization, and what are some of the most importantly, looking at repetitive type of incidents, and trying to really analyze a little bit on the lessons that can be picked from previous reports that have come through, so that you as an organization, you can proactively put in place measures that can prevent against similar incidents occurring again in the near future, and be able to also apportionate, the limited resource that charities we have in managing fraud, to ensure that they are, these resources are well or adequately used within the different organizations. So in a nutshell, these are some of the practical challenges that charities face in fraud detection and responding to fraud complaints, insider fraud complaints. And some of the solutions lie within what I've already mentioned. And Dave, I'll hand over back to you now for the next speaker. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Really interesting insight into how this works within a large international charity. And obviously, you mentioned prevention being a huge priority. The focus of this year's Charity Fraud Awareness Week is about fraud prevention, which obviously is the critical function of any counter-fraud team, in my view, to try and do everything we can do to prevent fraud from taking place. So thank you very much for that. So moving on now to Andy. So Andy Watson is the global head of anti-corruption for Oxfam GB, prior to which he led Transparency International's work on defence industry corruption. He, like other people here, not far away, have got a law enforcement background and was an ex-detective in the Metropolitan Police, where he worked in Scotland Yard's anti-corruption command. He continues a tradition of heads of fraud for Oxfam by being the author of a book, or co-authoring Out of the Shadows, promoting openness and accountability in the global defence industry, which we'd all agree is a right riveting read. Thank you very much, Andy. Over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Dave. It's not quite a book, but yeah, certainly an article which might be of interest. But thank you. And I just wanted to start by saying that I think, Ash has actually laid the groundwork for some of the things which I wanted to kind of build on and mention. Asha mentioned a lot around making people aware of, what policies are and, how to respond and, why those things are important. But I think the other thing which people within this community, within the counter-fraud, the counter-corruption community sometimes miss is also trying to make people care about it, or conveying why people should care about it in the same way. So the first point to make was that I think everyone who works within this sort of arena, we need to think more carefully about how we frame our messaging around counter-fraud and counter-corruption. In a world where there's more and more demands on colleagues' time to conduct mandatory training and follow procedures and understand policies, it's easy for something like fraud to fall into a box of things that people really struggle to engage with. And I think it's a mistake to assume that everyone fully understands why tackling fraud and corruption is so important, and particularly for tackling insider threats and for this sector in particular. So something we've been working on really hard at Oxfam GB is to reframe our messaging on fraud and corruption away from the traditional compliance type language towards a slightly more engaged debate about what the impact of fraud and corruption is, both on our wider society, our global society, but then linking that into Oxfam's mission in particular. When I ask people in training why fraud and corruption is bad, you initially get your kind of standard type of responses. It's illegal, we're losing money, there's reputational impacts, charitable funds are diverted. But actually, when you develop those conversations a little further, you start to look at some really interesting messaging, which really resonates with staff. If you take Oxfam as an example, our organization's mission is to eliminate poverty and inequality. Well, corruption is one of the biggest drivers of global poverty, and it means that every time a corrupt act affects Oxfam, it's sustaining the very systems which are causing the poverty in the first place. In other words, it's fundamentally undermining the organization's own mission. And in this sector, we're really fortunate to have colleagues who are particularly ethically minded and keen to engage on the intellectual content of issues. And we can use that to explore some of the underlying impacts of fraud and corruption. And if we can do that more convincingly, if we can convey the human impact and the link of why fraud and corruption in your organization, you know, and how it links to the mission of the organization, it can start to just shift the game in terms of generating an ethical culture where speaking up is not just seen as the right thing to do, but actually a personal duty to protect others, to protect the organization's mission, to protect society as a whole. So I think it's really important to just start to shift the language, and this goes beyond this sector as well. You know, the people within the counter fraud, counter corruption community, I think sometimes really struggle to convey why or what the impact really is and that human element to it, and I think that's really critical. The second thing I wanted to mention is that another sort of campaign that we've got going within my team, within the organization, is to focus on doing the basics well. While it's sometimes the case that organizations are targeted by like really sophisticated criminal enterprises, when it comes to insider threats, I think we often find that the fraud or corrupt act isn't actually very sophisticated at all, and it's a failure of basic process combined with ineffective management, which was mentioned earlier, which enables people to abuse their position. I mean, we heard some examples earlier from Tracy, but you know, I don't know, it might be someone who's managing the finances of the organization and is responsible for every single element, and there's no separation of duties. Or it might be the basic procurement processes aren't followed, or due diligence is evaded, or we heard about the recruitment issues earlier from Tracy. And all of that can be compounded by a lack of sort of quite routine but effective oversight, and a failure in basic supervision, I think, is prevalent to all insider threat cases. I think it's, you know, I've never encountered an insider threat case where that hasn't really been part of the problem, at least. So if supervision and leadership is effective, on the other hand, it creates an environment which empowers staff by giving them the time and resources to do the basic things really well. It rewards good practice. We encourage speaking up. It creates a more hostile environment for people who want to act dishonestly. And of course, it also means that managers can spot unusual behavior or stresses and strains that staff are under, which promotes quite possibly uncharacteristically dishonest behavior within people. So we hear a lot of tone from the top. You know, tone from the top's a phrase that's been around a very long time, although I'm not sure we've ever really got that right. Tone from the middle, I think, is arguably a little bit more important, because you know, the middle managers, they're the people who know their staff better. They're the ones overseeing some of these basic things. And I think it's important that we empower middle managers with the resources and the support and time to make sure they can do their job well, which will mean also that their own staff are not under the kind of pressures, which means that they don't do the basics well. So doing the basics well, I think, you know, is it sounds simple, but it's not something which is actually very easy to implement, I think, in practice. The final point I wanted to make, and Ash has spent time on this already, and I know Liz will spend time on this, but it's a reflective of how important it is. For insider threat in particular, the most common and valuable method of detection is through other people speaking up about it and challenging behavior, whistleblowers effectively. So it's absolutely critical that organizations have a mechanism for handling concerns that are raised, and that the staff have confidence in using whatever that system is. And I think we could speak for days, you know, on all the aspects of whistleblowing and how to get it right, and we'd only just be scratching the surface, but there's a few things which I think are really important. I think the first thing is the system has to be bespoke to your organization from the people who may wish to actually report, and that includes third parties. For some organizations like Oxfam, having an off-the-shelf corporate solution, which might work for a bank in East London, or any organization in the global north, that's hopeless for an organization like Oxfam, where the lion's share of our work is conducted with the most marginalized communities in fragile states. Similarly, what my organization may need wouldn't be at all practical for a small and medium-sized charity where there's only a handful of people. So it's important to have something which is bespoke, in as much as, you know, and there's been some thought into, will this actually work if somebody needs to use it? who is the person theoretically that could report? How are they going to do that? And what happens next if they actually do? And that answer to that question will change depending on the nature of the organization, but it does, I think it's important to kind of think that one through in practice. And that brings me to my next point, which is that whatever type of organization we are, there has to be a tried and tested system for actually receiving and assessing and responding to those concerns. And Ash has mentioned that already. In our larger organizations, that could mean an entire team of people dedicated to doing this. And if you are one of those organizations, I think it's really essential to have staff with people who have like extensive experience of handling whistleblowing investigations and responding to them. But for small and medium-sized charities where that isn't proportionate, there still needs to be a mechanism where it's entirely clear what is going to happen and how that's going to work. Otherwise, it will lead to things like accidental confidentiality breaches and so on. Whistleblowing is a highly complex area, not least for the person reporting. So putting some thought into it and what will actually happen in practice, I think, is important. Of course, if you're in Europe, then there's a legislative framework which is already imminently, you need to comply with. I think in the UK, we are moving, towards a situation where the legislative framework will change, and we're going to need to kind of implement that. The good news is that there's organisations like Protect, which can really help with some of those issues. And with that in mind, I'll just hand back to Dave, and then hopefully we can hear from Liz a bit more about that.
Thanks, Andy. Perfect segue there. See, it saves me a job. But no, that's really good, Andy. I think your message over getting the basics right is absolutely spot on. And I love your comment over tone from the top is important, but we also need tone from the middle. I shall be shamelessly stealing that from now on. So thanks very much, Andy. Okay, so just a reminder that we will have a bit of time for some Q&A at the end of this. And there is really knowledgeable and experienced panel in this area. So I really would encourage you to take this opportunity of asked these questions that I know you all have. Okay, so I will now introduce Liz Gardner, who is the Chief Exec of Protect. She joined the charity 3 years ago as a legal officer and has experience in advising whistleblowers on the legal advice line and also providing training and consultancy to employers who wish to improve their whistleblowing. Prior to her current role, she was or is an employment solicitor with a previous career in policy and parliamentary campaigning. Liz, we're lucky to have you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. And I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about how whistleblowing plays a role in that identifying and prevention, hopefully, of the insider fraud threat. Just very briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with Protect, we're the UK's whistleblowing charity, and we have these three key roles. Firstly, we support workers who are unsure whether or how to raise a concern. And we have a free confidential legal advice line where we help around 3,000 people a year. And that amounts to about 45,000 in our history. Secondly, we know that encouraging speaking up needs to go hand in hand with supportive workplace cultures. And so we provide training and consultancy for employers and help them develop effective whistleblowing arrangements. And finally, with that unique perspective of understanding both the workers and the employer's views of whistleblowing, we campaign for change. And we've launched a campaign to update the UK's whistleblowing law. As Andy mentioned, there's changes in Europe and we want to continue to be global best practice. And I'll talk a little bit more about that campaign later. So what is whistleblowing? I'm sure most of you are very familiar with it, but here, there is no legal definition. So this is Protect's definition. It's a worker raising concern about wrongdoing, risk, or malpractice that affects others, so it's not about their private employment rights, with someone in authority either internally or externally. And I think it's really important to consider whistleblowing as something about an internal process, raising concerns with your employer. I think a lot of people, only see whistleblowing as what we see in the press when somebody's had to go outside because there's been a failure quite often of being able to raise that internally. And we really need to encourage internal whistleblowing because it's the workers who are the eyes and ears of the organisation who can help you identify risks early and stop the harm soonest. Because by the time a fraud goes externally to the police or the charity commission or someone else, it may be too late for that employer to take the action and put it right. It's also worth pointing out that whistleblowing at the moment, in terms of its legal definition, is only available to workers. Now, that's something that we want to see put right, because while the law has quite a wide definition of workers, we'd like to see it cover all of those people in the workplace who might uncover workplace wrongdoing. And in the charity sector, that's really important, because at the moment, volunteers and trustees are not included in the protections that the law has. But putting the legal side, the legal protection to one side, something we're campaigning to expand the scope of the protection, we need to think about what we want to include in our own policies when we're looking at who we should include in whistleblowing as charities. Because almost half of the disclosures, the whistleblowing disclosures that the Charity Commission received last year came from those who were not employees. So if you're a charity leader looking at your whistleblowing arrangements and thinking about the insider threat, think about who you want to include in that policy, groups of people you want to hear from. And that might very well include volunteers or your charity trustees, or indeed your contractors and suppliers, who may be the first people to see that something's going wrong in your organisation. So making your whistleblowing arrangements open to them too could be really helpful. And I want to explain a little bit about how Protect can help. Callers from the charity sector now make up almost 1/5 of all our calls. And our advice line is quite unique, because we advise people not just on their employment rights, which are not to suffer detriment or dismissal for raising public interest concerns, but we also advise them on how to raise the concern effectively, whether that's internally to the employer or in some cases externally too. And we provide a triage service for the Charity Commission, and they encourage all charity sector whistleblowers to come to us first to discuss whether and how to raise the concern best. And the concerns we receive from the charity sector are hugely wide-ranging, from bullying and harassment to poor governance, from data protection to abuse of charity beneficiaries. But they are also about fraud and financial mismanagement. I think it's really interesting to note that in the latest Charity Commission report about their disclosures, 28% of their concerns are now about financial mismanagement. And we were quite shocked early in the pandemic to have callers from charity workers discussing this new kind of fraud, which is we called furlough leave fraud. So even in the charity sector, some employers were putting workers on furlough leave, claiming the government money and inviting them to come in and carry on working, perhaps with the label of volunteers instead. Now that was clearly contrary to the government guidelines, and it put those workers in a really difficult position. Just as a matter of interest, we had a huge amount of calls last year. It's our busiest year ever. And many of those calls were directly related to the pandemic, whether it was about health and safety or PPE. But a huge new concern for us was about furlough leave fraud. It was a whole new area of fraud that we hadn't seen before. Indeed, 62% of all the cases that we had over the year that we analysed in this report were about furlough leave fraud. So that was about employers who were claiming from the government fund, but asking workers to come and work, or others that were not passing on all the money to their workers. And what we found when we looked into this was that many of these calls came from organisations which are extremely small. And we know that there are something like 168,000 charities in the UK. Many of those will be extremely small. And what those whistleblowers told us is that there was nowhere in their organisation that they could raise concerns. And that meant they very often went straight to HMRC or to another regulator. Sadly, we also looked at people who had raised their concerns internally, and we were quite surprised to find such a high number of whistleblowers said their concerns were simply ignored by their employer. And that was even when they were raising health and safety concerns in the middle of a pandemic. They felt that their concerns were ignored. I'd like to think that there was perhaps a poor feedback loop from a number of those employers, but it's a really important message that if you're dealing with whistleblowers, you need to give them an assurance that you're taking their concerns seriously and that you're investigating, and tell them what happened. But also we see too many whistleblowers are still suffering detriment, and 20% of those lost their jobs. The figures here suggest to us that there isn't actually a problem with people speaking up and coming forward, but there is a problem with the employer's response. And I think that's what we need to address, because whistleblowing can be really important in the fight against fraud. Here are some statistics that demonstrate how important that insider tip-off is in identifying fraud. And getting your internal culture right so that people feel safe to come forward can help you detect fraud earlier. And whistleblowing arrangements play a really complementary role to the counter-fraud arrangements that Asha spoke about earlier. Because while some fraud can be very simple, others can be very complex. Accounting frauds, for example, can be very difficult for workers to recognise. And workers may be uncertain that what they've seen actually would meet a definition of fraud. And you have to ask yourself, what do you want your employees to do if they're not sure? Do you want them to keep quiet until they're absolutely certain this is a major problem, or raise it as a possible concern? What about a risk of fraud that hasn't happened yet? They've seen some things that are going wrong in the controls, and it might become a fraud if you don't take action. Should they report that through the fraud policy? If they're not sure, whistleblowing is that sort of wider funnel that can capture those risks at an early stage. And a much bigger risk that they might not want to use your fraud policy might be that they're fearful. Fraud may be, as other colleagues have said, being conducted by someone higher up in the organisation. Indeed, there was a PwC economic crime survey last year that said 78% of internal fraud in the UK was conducted by senior or middle managers. So a whistleblower might think that if they're raising their concerns, they're going to lose their job, they're going to be treated badly, or indeed that no one's going to listen because the senior managers are involved. And that's why it's really important that you have somebody who whistleblowers can go to outside your normal course of management, who they can go to safely to feel they can raise their concerns. So what do charities need to do to improve whistleblowing? Well, last year we worked with a pilot group of charities and we assessed with them their whistleblowing arrangements. And while we found many had lots of good policies in place, we found that they needed to do more, both to train staff and to managers, and to train managers. Because in our experience, whistleblowers are not persistent. Most will raise their concern only the once. So how your managers respond to that concern, and again, that tone from the middle that Andy spoke about, is so important. We also found that there were some very good intentions, particularly set out in the policies around protecting confidentiality and providing feedback, but they weren't always backed up with evidence that this had happened. And there was a general need to test whether your workers in the charity sector are confident and have confidence in the arrangements that you've put in place. So the question that if you are putting in place or reviewing your whistleblowing arrangements, ask yourself, how do you know if they're working? Are you confident that staff are going to be, who might be detecting wrongdoing, know where to go, whether it's fraud or another form of wrongdoing? Will they feel safe to speak up? And are you confident that your managers will protect them if they do? And here at Protect, we can help you with this. And we sort of suggest that you look at all of these areas when you're doing that review. The first one is, how effective is your governance? Have you got the right policies in place? Are your procedures accessible, well written, and, as Andy was saying, appropriate to your organisation? And what's your review and reporting structures there? Secondly, the really important piece around engaging with your staff, what communications you're putting in place, what training there is, and and your ability to test staff confidence in using those whistleblowing arrangements. And finally, have you looked at the operations piece? What in practice happens to a whistleblower using that system? Are they actually protected from detriment? And have you finished that loop and provided the feedback? We don't pretend it's an easy job to create a safe culture for workers to speak up in, but we do think it's worth the attempt. And given the scale of insider threat that we've heard about today, the question is really, can you afford not to? Thanks very much, and I'll hand back to you there, Dave.
Thanks very much, Liz. I mean, that was a really insightful talk about whistleblowing. I mean, I can only agree with what you've said. The importance of making sure that you've got an effective whistleblowing strategy and policies, and that's not just a rhetoric, is actually acted upon and is part of the sort of breadth and depth of the organisation is absolutely critical. And those organisations that have a solid, strong whistleblowing policy will absolutely reap the rewards, particularly when dealing with something as important as the threat from insiders. We are out of time. So in concluding this webinar, I'd just like to thank you all for attending and for listening, and particularly our guest speakers, Tracy, Andy, Aisha and Liz. So this webinar will be available on demand from our website, which is preventcharityfraud.org.uk, where you'll also find a load of other useful material resources to help you with the management of fraud within the charities. Thank you very much and goodbye.